Today, she is in her own right and accord, without reference to kith or kin, a highly respected columnist and socio-political blogger who is much appreciated by all of us for her speaking up for the disaffected in almost all spheres, including discriminations based on gender, religion, race, politics, and even sexual orientation. Today, we all admire her for her strongly principled and steadfast commentary with apparent disregard for possible consequences of government censure, poison pen letters, and threats from the small but loud minority present in the extreme fringes of all organizations, whether secular or religious. I now call upon Dato' Paduka Marina Mahathir to address us.
Thank you, Dr. Yeo. His Excellency, Mr. Vijay Gokhale, High Commissioner of India, His Excellency, Mr. Kamal Malhotra, Resident Representative of the United Nations Development Programme, Yang Bahagia Datuk Mahathir Shankar, former Chairman of the Gandhi Memorial Trust, Mr. S. Radhakrishnan, Chairman of the Gandhi Memorial Trust, my fellow speaker, Yang Bahagia Tan Sri Hasmi Agam, Chairman of the Human Rights Commission Malaysia, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. First of all, let me thank the High Commission of India and the Gandhi Memorial Trust for inviting me to speak at the celebration of the 142nd birth anniversary of Mahatma Gandhi, as well as the International Day of Non-Violence. I'm truly honored to give the second Gandhi Memorial Lecture and to share this honor with another distinguished speaker, Tan Sri Hasmi Agam. Ladies and gentlemen, I've been mulling about what I should talk about today for some time. There have been reams written about the Mahatma, and it's not been easy to find something new to say about him. So I hope you will forgive this sometimes meandering ruminations as I imagine what would it be like if he lived today. To many people, the first thing that comes to mind when talking about Mahatma Gandhi is, of course, his doctrine of non-violence. I think by far this is his greatest contribution to the world, that rebellion against injustice can be achieved through non-violent means, that to protest against such injustices is a human right, because injustice itself is a violation of those human rights. And because injustice is often violent, to protest in a non-violent manner is also a statement in itself. Not that the world, despite its admiration for Gandhi, has been able to follow his doctrine in practice at all. When we look at the amount of violence today all around the world, we have to wonder what the Mahatma would have thought. Violence today has become more widespread, more sophisticated, and more diversified. We're seeing every day different types of violence perpetrated by different people using different means. Are any of them justified, and would all of them merit the same nonviolent response? In Gandhi's day, his main concern was the sort of violence perpetrated by colonizers against the colonized. This included both the British government's colonization of India and the demand by Indians for self-determination, as well as the social colonization of the haves in Indian society over the have-nots, especially those from the untouchable classes. Perhaps less well known is that Gandhi was also an opponent of the formation of the State of Israel. Although he sympathized greatly with the plight of Jews who were being persecuted in Germany, nevertheless, Gandhi thought the answer was not the setting up of a Jewish state in Palestine. The Palestine of the biblical conception, he said, is not a geographical tract. It is in their hearts. But if they must look to the Palestine of geography as their national home, it is wrong to enter it under the shadow of the British gun. A religious act cannot be performed with the aid of the bayonet or the bomb. They can settle in Palestine only by the goodwill of the Arabs. they should seek to convert the Arab heart. As we know, nobody listened then to Gandhi, and the Palestine issue is still with us today, as indeed colonialism still is, and taking on more violent forms than ever before. Today we have at least two countries, Afghanistan and Iraq, with hundreds of foreign soldiers on their soil, attempting unsuccessfully to bring peace to those countries. Instead of development, both Iraq and Afghanistan have been laid waste to violence and are unable to govern themselves for some time to come. Furthermore, the violence perpetuated is today much more sophisticated, operated from a distance, and causing many more deaths and injuries in civilian populations than ever before. How many times have we seen reports of drone attacks causing many civilian deaths in Afghanistan, or suicide bombers killing and injuring innocent people? Today, too, we have seen more diverse forms of weaponry, not just more technologically sophisticated ones, but also chemical weapons, even those declared illegal by the international community. In Gaza, doctors treating the injured reported the use of white phosphorus, which burns the skin as long as oxygen is available. These doctors also reported the use of dense inert metal explosives, or DIME, a type of bomb fired from Israeli planes which hit the ground, bounce up again, and then explode, sending out hundreds of sharp blades and shrapnel. The injuries caused by these shrapnel include amputated legs, arms, and heads. Needless to say, DIME does not differentiate between adults and children, soldiers and civilians. Let us not forget that the threat of nuclear weapons still looms over us today. Despite the global anti-nuclear movement, today there are still several countries that insist on having nuclear weapons, including the United States and Israel. Additionally, the conventional arms trade is today estimated to be valued at $1.5 trillion yearly, or 2.7% of the world's GDP. The United States alone accounts for 42.8% of the world's defense spending and 4.8% of its GDP. It's also the largest exporter of armaments, thus spreading violence and death all around the world. As the director Michael Moore pointed out in his documentary Bowling for Columbine, in an environment where it's not considered unusual to manufacture, buy, and sell weaponry, violence becomes an idea that seeps into the community and the minds of individuals, with fatal consequences for many innocent victims. The Nobel Peace Laureate Oscar Arias Sanchez, former president of Costa Rica, a country without an army, noted the same phenomenon. When a country decides to invest in arms rather than in education, housing, the environment, and health services for its people, it is depriving a whole generation of its right to prosperity and happiness. We have produced one firearm for every 10 inhabitants of this planet, and yet we have not bothered to end hunger when such a feat is well within our reach. Our international regulations allow almost 3/4 of all global arms sales to pour into the developing world with no binding international guidelines whatsoever. Our regulations do not hold countries accountable for what is done with the weapons they sell, even when the probable use of such weapons is obvious. Thus, the world in 2011 is much more awash in the means to violence than in the days of Gandhi, although he lived to see the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and was a sharp critic of the use of nuclear bombs. In 1946, he remarked, "I regard the employment of the atom bomb for the wholesale destruction of men, women, and children as the most diabolical use of science." Sadly, this diabolical use of science continues unabated today. What about the causes of violent conflict? No longer is it just colonization that is causing conflict, but different issues have arisen of late that may not have existed in Gandhi's day. Globalization has linked the countries of the world as never before, but its benefits have not been evenly distributed over all countries. The divide between rich and poor nations remain large. Developing nations still suffer a bigger share of the world's poverty, illiteracy, and ill health. They are less able to cope with shocks in the world's economic system. If the developed world to which they export suffers a recession, they suffer worse from the effects of those cutbacks. These types of economic inequalities lead to a new phenomenon, human migration, where people move from their own region or country to another to seek a better life. If badly managed, this can lead to conflicts with the native people of the host countries. Migrants now make up 214 million people who leave their countries for work or to seek refuge from crises in their own countries, including conflicts. According to the International Organization for Migration, this means that 1 in every 33 people in the world is an international migrant. As displaced people and refugees, or even simply as foreign workers in a country, these migrants become vulnerable to violence, as well as other disadvantages such as lack of access to healthcare. Additionally, there are the effects of relatively new phenomena such as climate change. When people are displaced by environmental disasters caused by climate change, such as drought or floods, they encroach on other people's land. Conflicts arise when more people are forced to find food from the same limited resources. Refugees forced to live in deplorable conditions invariably rebel and start to fight with both fellow refugees and their unwilling hosts. What is happening in Somalia is a case in point where hundreds of thousands of famine-stricken people have been forced to move in search of food, sparking an immense humanitarian crisis. In many cases, compared to Gandhi's day, the perpetrators of violence have also diversified. Where before it was often states that inflicted violence on people, today there may be non-state actors or even communities that may cause such violence. For instance, the existence of networks of people who believe that violence is the only response to injustice, thus leading to events such as 9/11, the Bali bombings, and other violent events such as the suicide bombing of houses of worship. Gender-based violence has also been well documented, for example, in Bosnia, in Indonesia in 1998, and more recently in the Congo and in Libya. The targets of such violence are also diverse. Sometimes it's certain communities, sometimes the more vulnerable sections of the population, such as women, and sometimes targets are randomly picked. In all this, let us not forget the role of the media in both highlighting, perpetuating, and sometimes even possibly encouraging violence. Violence is almost always sensational, and if one reads the news, it is possible to think that everyone around the world is inclined towards violence. Every day there is a suicide bomber blowing up someone, or a murder is committed yet again somewhere. On television, we see both factual and fictional violence so seamlessly broadcast together that for a while we find it hard to differentiate between what is real and what is not. And that is why some of our first reactions to the planes flying into the World Trade Center on September 11, 2001 was uncertainty as to whether it was computer-generated imaging or real. So used are we to disaster movies. The media fascination with violence has two main effects. Firstly, it inures us to violence, so much so that we become less and less able to empathize when something dreadful happens. We no longer remember that every person killed through conflict is someone's son or daughter, husband or wife or friend. We may count bodies, but we don't see them as someone's loved one lost to violence. As long as it's not anyone we know, we don't care too much. Secondly, media tends to persuade us that the only answer to violence is more violence. Picture the cheers that went up among many Americans when the news got out that Osama bin Laden had been killed. It seemed a natural progression, if you can call it that, from a response that has been just as violent, if not more, and in fact has caused more casualties than were killed in the September 11 attacks alone. According to the Cost of War Project at Brown University, a very conservative estimate is that about 137,000 civilians have been killed in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Pakistan, and that the wars have created more than 7.8 million refugees in these countries. And to prove Oscar Arias Sanchez's words, the Brown Project also puts the war's ultimate cost, including interest payments and veterans' care, to the United States at up to $4 trillion, equivalent to the country's cumulative budget deficits for the 6 years from 2005 to 2010. The media's obsessive attention to violence thus has a cyclical effect in that it only promotes further violence, which in turn continually feeds the media's hunger for sensationalism. Yet what the media chooses to highlight is far from the entire story of any news item. Gandhian principles of non-violence are alive and well today, even though they may not seem as newsworthy to media corporations. Allow me to talk about some of them. Julia Bacha is a young filmmaker who made a documentary on nonviolent resistance in the West Bank. In her TED Talks lecture, she makes the case for greater attention on nonviolent protests in Palestine because she believes that it inspires people to replicate the same model and therefore break the cycle of violence around them. Her documentary tells the story of the Palestinian village of Budrus that embarked on a 10-month-long non-violent protest against the building of a barrier by the Israelis that cut across their olive groves. Their persistence, perseverance, and resolute committal to non-violence eventually paid off. What's more, when Julia's documentary was shown to other villages, it spurred those villagers to embark on the same type of protest in the hope that these would yield the same results. Media attention to such a movement would serve several